So good morning once again. For my talk today, I wanted to look at the concept of, I guess what you call generational differences. You know, how every 20 years or so, a new generation comes along, and within its members, there tend to be like certain shared attitudes and values, and these shared aspects are essentially the result of highly influential events that members of each generation experience collectively, right? According to sociological theory, it seems that major national and global events are especially impactful when they are experienced in the impressionable years, the years of one's coming of age, so to speak, the years during which one enters into adulthood, typically around 18 or so. And from a Buddhist view, this is just another example of the working of impermanence in our lives, I think. Indeed, this demonstrates the awesome power of impermanence, of constant, unpredictable change to actually affect an entire generation of people. And so I think, first of all, I think you'd agree, maybe whether you're very young or very old or in between, that there are in fact differences between generations, right? For example, I saw this one kind of tongue-in-cheek article that was making observations about how generations differ in terms of what they consider valuable. So, for example, in terms of their preferred choice of transportation. So for one of the earliest generations, for the so-called greatest generation and the silent generation, those are people born before World War II, it was dreaming about that 55 T-bird. But for baby boomers, it was their soon-to-be repossessed BMW. For Gen Xers, the Gen Xers are the kids of the boomers, right? It was that handmade Dutch bicycle. And then for millennials, it's of course Lyft, and for Gen Y, it's Mom's Prius. Another difference, this article pointed out was seen when comparing each generation's biggest entertainment expenditure. So for the greatest generation and the silent generation, it was those $35 tickets for Oklahoma at the community theater. For boomers, it's that $5,000 spent on platinum Rolling Stones tickets. For Gen Xers, it's the $2,000 to attend Burning Man. For millennials, it's the $900 they spent on Coachella. And for Gen Y, it was that $26.95 on the video game Minecraft. And then there's similar differences, when the question was, what social network did you turn away from? What social network did you turn to when you left Facebook? So not surprisingly, all the younger generations, and by the way, it's not a slam on Facebook, we're streaming right now on Facebook, so Facebook, thank you very much for hosting our stream. But when you turned away from Facebook, where did you turn to? And for the younger generations, naturally it was other social media networks like LinkedIn, Tinder, and Instagram. But for the boomers, it was Match.com. And for the greatest and silent generations, it was the Rotary Club. So again, this is tongue-in-cheek, but it shows you that there are differences amongst the generations. And of course, if you're a millennial or Gen Y or something, you don't even know what a Rotary Club is, right? So there are definitely differences. But right now I want to look a little bit closer at each generation and at the defining events that shape them. So at this part of my talk, as I go over each generation, if you want to, you can let me know in the comments if this is in fact your generation. Of course, I doubt that there would be anyone from the first two generations here, the earliest generations, but I'm interested in knowing if we have representatives from all or most of the other generations that are present today. And then, by the way, this information is mostly from Wikipedia, and then in some cases, to be honest, it's not always flattering to the generation. But if you're from one of these generations that's described somewhat negatively, I think you can take some consolation in knowing that it's not about you. Don't take it personally, because it's about your entire generation. Okay, so let's see. Let me show this generation timeline here. So what you're looking at is a generational timeline chart, and I think the key thing to notice, there's a lot of detail in here, but the key thing to note here is that if you look at each one of these bars for each generation, the timeline of the generation, you'll notice that for each generation there's a lighter colored bar and then a darker colored bar. And so the most significant points here is, for instance, in the lost generation, where you see at the very left edge, you see the upward slope, and then it sort of flattens out right there of the lighter bar, and then there's a darker bar that does the same thing. It rises upward and then flattens out. So those 2 points are the most important points, because this is that point where it flattens out represents the age, when the first members of the generation came of age, so to speak. And then the darker point where it flattens out represents when the latest members of the generation came of age. So between those 2 points, points where the line flattens out, those are the most important details. And this is when the generation typically came of age. So the first generation on the chart is the lost generation. These are people who came of age during World War I. They were born between 1883 and 1900. And the word lost, understandably, it refers to the sort of disoriented and directionless spirit of many of those that survived the devastation of World War I in the early 20th century. And then next, the greatest generation is the group or cohort, to use the term on the chart, that was born from 1901 to 1927. They were, of course, shaped by the Great Depression and were the primary participants in World War II. This term, greatest generation, was popularized in a book that was written by the former NBC News anchorman Tom Brokaw. I'm sure some of you, those of you that are baby boomers and older, probably know Tom Brokaw. In his book, Tom Brokaw wrote that these men and women fought not for fame or recognition, but because it was, quote, the right thing to do. That's why they're called the greatest generation. The next is the silent generation, and these are people born from 1928 to 1945, and they also comprise what was called the silent majority. According to Wikipedia, one reason that is proposed for their silence is that they came of age during the infamous McCarthy era of the 50s. This is when Senator Joseph McCarthy rose to power through a campaign that was aimed at stoking fear of communism. And in this kind of repressive atmosphere, many members of the silent generation felt that it was unwise to speak out. And the next generation is the baby boomer generation, also known as the me generation. Baby boomers were born from 1946 to 1964 during the post-World War II baby boom. Boomers came of age in the 60s and 70s, which was a time of great social change. The Vietnam War was seen as increasingly tragic, and then there was a growing anti-war sentiment that was reflected in the counterculture of the 1960s. This counterculture was memorably captured in the 1965 film Woodstock. Of course, other notable events that affected this generation were the tragic assassinations of John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Bobby Kennedy, as well as the civil rights movement and the feminist movement of the 1970s. Another factor that's associated with the boomers is that they are, widely associated with having privilege. This is because they came of age in a time when there was increasing affluence. There were a lot of government subsidies and stuff like that for veterans and other kinds of subsidies. And generally speaking, the global economy was growing tremendously during that period. And so, not surprisingly, baby boomers typically expected the world to improve with time. Let me see. Have any of you acknowledged that you're baby boomers on here? All of you are baby boomers, aren't you? Or most of you. And so, and then in terms of technology, baby boomers comprise the first generation to grow up with TV. This is really interesting. So if you're a boomer, you remember, I'm sure, Howdy Doody, the Mickey Mouse Club, I Love Lucy, Captain Kangaroo, Father Knows Best, Leave It to Beaver, The Twilight Zone, The Ed Sullivan Show, and many, many, many other shows that are no longer on the air. Or actually, let me take that back. The Twilight Zone reruns are still on TV. Isn't that right, Diane? Diane watches them. Okay, Bruce says he's a boomer. Okay, yeah. I know all the rest of you are pretty much boomers, right? So, and then the next generation is Generation X, or Gen X. This is a group with birth years between 1965 and 1980. Most members of Generation X are the children of the silent generation and baby boomers. And in terms of technological developments, as adolescents and young adults in the 1980s and 1990s, Gen Xers were often dubbed the MTV generation. This is when the music video channel came on the air and really was very popular. And as opposed to the music of the boomers, which was largely rock music and Motown music, right? The Gen X youth were more likely to be into grunge and hip hop. Notably, Generation X was the first generation to experience a lower quality of life than the preceding generation. Of course, if you're a Gen Xer, that's not your fault. But then, not surprisingly, the term Generation X has also been used to generally describe alienated youth. Here, the X refers to the unknown, or perhaps, to the uncertain. And next, we have the Millennials. Millennials, also known as the Gen Y. This is a group that born from 1981 to 1996. And most Millennials are the children of baby boomers and Gen Xers. And members of this generation are known as Millennials because, they came of age, they became adults around the beginning of the millennium. Relative to Gen Xers, this is a larger group. This group is about the size of the baby boomer group. And in fact, I think recently there was a statistic that said that there are now, due to the deaths of some of the baby boomers, this millennial generation is actually now bigger than the baby boomer generation. And this generation, the millennials, makes frequent use of the internet, mobile devices, and social media. But unfortunately, the 2008 recession had a major impact on this generation because it caused very high levels of unemployment among young people. And so this phenomenon of unemployment explains why another term for millennials is the quote-unquote boomerang generation, because of a trend of their returning to live with their parents. Yes. Generation Z is the next generation, also known as the Zoomers, are those born between 1997 and 2012. Most members of the Generation Z are children of Gen Xers and Millennials. Unlike the older Millennials, the Gen Z group typically have little or no memories of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. However, since they had not yet come of age when the attacks occurred, 2001, as a generation, they sadly have no memory of a time that the United States was not at war with global terrorists, which is a very sad statistic, right? And so some psychologists suggest that this could result in a kind of unsettled feeling among the people of Generation Z. And because of the 2008 recession, they are concerned about student debt. They're worried about being able to afford a college education at all. But on the other hand, if there's a silver lining to financial uncertainty, it's that the recession has taught Generation Z to be more creative in terms of making career choices, and this seems to have led to a growing kind of entrepreneurial spirit. of course, on the other hand, some analysts see the widespread use of smartphones and social media as actually having a downside, and so depression has been said to be more common among Gen Z than any previous generation, with increased technological and online dependence and decreased face-to-face interaction as a key cause. Well, of course, actually, in the current, coronavirus lockdown, this is true of all of us, right? We're all experiencing some form of depression because of increased online dependence. Hopefully, this online streaming service isn't depressing you, but this is true of all of us. The last generation on the chart is Generation Alpha. This is the first generation to be born entirely in the 21st century. So they were born between 2013 and into the mid-2020s. And most of the members of Generation Alpha are the children of Millennials. And many members of Generation Alpha are currently, growing up using smartphones and tablets as part of their childhood entertainment and their childhood education. Some of their parents even use digital devices as pacifiers. And this is true of my son, who relies on this weird electronic white noise generator to help put our grandson to sleep. And as a matter of fact, some of their parents, some of these millennial parents, being heavy social media users, have even created a social media account for their baby or their toddler. Well, the first wave of Generation Alpha will reach adulthood by the 2030s. And by that time, the global population is expected to be 9 billion people. Right now, it's about 7 billion, I think. And so for me, as a boomer myself, the Generation Alpha represents, my and our grandchildren. And so for their sake, I certainly hope that they can enjoy, a good enough life. Okay, Trish has said, yeah, okay. Chuck is a silent generation, and Trish is a boomer. Yes, thank you, Tom. Tina is a tail end boomer. Okay, you have probably characteristics of both boomers and Gen Xers. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not. But anyway, so as we've seen, each generation has distinct views because of the unique causes and conditions that they experience during their impressionable coming of age years. And as I mentioned in my opening, from a Buddhist view, this clearly demonstrates the really the awesome power of impermanence, constant and unpredictable change that can actually affect an entire generation of people. But then of course I think you're probably expecting me to say this, but on the other hand, in another sense, even though we're all members of different generations, the question is, are we really that different? Because in terms of the national and international events that I've mentioned here, like world wars, socio-political turmoil, of course pandemics, and climate change. These are kinds of changes that affect all of us. And so from a sort of an overarching Buddhist point of view, we're all actually experiencing the same constant change together. So, on the one hand, although the preceding examination of generations, emphasized their differences, but seen through the lens of the Buddhist teachings, we're actually all, interconnected in the same never-ending flow of impermanence. And I think that interconnectedness is really. I saw one of my teachers once said that the truth that Buddhism provides is the teaching of impermanence, and if that's really sort of internalized deeply, then it in a sense becomes a gift, because the gift is seeing this interconnectedness of all life. And so, speaking of this interconnectedness, Buddhism, of course, does emphasize, keeping our being mindful of the present moment. But it's also true that there's a teaching called karma in Buddhism, that what we do and how we think in the present moment, in a sense, creates the moments yet to come, right? So we are connected. We're in the present, but we're also, in a sense, connected to the future. And if we have this kind of insight into the interconnectedness, the main, underlying teaching of Buddhism, then it can help us naturally think of ways that we can support the lives of the younger generations that will actually, of course, outlive our generation. So, for example, we might naturally try to be as environmentally green as possible. I think Buddhism is teaching us that we should be concerned not just about the quality of our life, but really the quality of all life. And so if we keep in mind our underlying interconnectedness, this can help us see, in a sense, past our generational differences and actually past all of our differences, and guide us to make the most compassionate and awakened choices. So this is my talk for today. Thank you for listening. Now,